Greetings and bienvenue, midnight crew. Thank you for returning to this broadcast, and welcome to new viewers joining us for the first time. If you like a video, then feel free to subscribe.
Massive paranormal area chock full of witches, abandoned mines, and centuries of folklore goes ignored by X. What gives?
My mom insists that one day when I was maybe 3 I came to her and said that the man in the red shirt in my room left and was going to break my dad's work van. She got a call pretty much right after from my dad's office that he'd be late because the truck was stuck under a downed power line. In second grade, remember going to a birthday party at my friend's house and being kinda unnerved that their house looked exactly like a dream I had. Even though I'd never been in it. I was in third grade the night my Oma died. I had woken up and for some reason just decided I should get dressed, even though it was like 2 a.m. I went to my mom's bedroom and she was like, "What are you doing?" She got the phone call from the nursing home like 5 minutes later. I can kinda remember the scene, but the thing I remember most is how compelling the feeling to get dressed was. I'm super skeptical about everything except maybe aliens, but if there's anything in my life that makes me believe that maybe there's something else there, it was this night. I was maybe 11 or 12 and went to summer camp. 2 of my friends and I had to go to the shower house in the middle of the night. The camp was basically just one giant road with a bunch of sites for each troop that branches off, but the sites were only ever like 100 feet off the road. Anyway, you could only go 2 directions. One way ended at the offices, parking lot and bathhouses. The other at the swimming lake, which was well lit. I looked at Google Maps a lot and this trail is maybe only a mile end to end. I swear we turned the wrong way and walked for a solid hour towards the lake and never reached it. In fact, I remember the night being pitch black and the trail almost glowing red, which was an observation we all made during the time and recalling after when we finally decided that maybe we took a weird path and should turn around. We walked for less than 5 minutes in the other direction and we were at the bathhouses. It was just a straight road we walked on. No curves or anything. We should have had to walk the hour we walking plus the 10 minutes it would have taken to the bathhouses if we walked the correct way. And usually you could see all the campfires from the trail as you walked, but after the first few we stopped seeing them. Even though no matter what direction you went they basically lined the whole trail. When we got back our scout masters were freaking the fuck out because they thought we were lost, and they were kinda young and I'm pretty sure used scouts to hook up with our moms, so they were really concerned they shit the bed. Speaking of shitting the bed, at the same scout camp a bear shat right next to our tent. Had to have been a huge one. Not really paranormal, but it's interesting to think we slept through a bear like a foot away from our cots. I went camping with one of those friends on the Appalachian Trail since being an adult and we could see a fire that was a decent way off in the distance, but not like miles. You could clearly tell it was a fire. But as you looked at it, it looked like it got closer or farther away. Which we were like, that's weird, and didn't think anything of it. Couldn't find any traces of a pit or that anyone else was even camping near us the next morning. And we were up with the dawn. One time at his stepdad's cabin we turned the lights out entirely to try to look at the stars and a bar flew directly into my forehead and it hurt like shit. That's all I can think of right now.
Blood Mountain has some interesting lore about a past incident which gave it its name. Blairsville is interesting and quite pretty to visit. I never got a sinister feeling from the mountains of North Georgia, but I am a Canadian used to exploring the mountains of British Columbia and the back country of Saskatchewan. That said, I was camping with my future wife and our dog near Blairsville once and there were strange sounds outside the tent. Initially thought they were owls, but they were scurrying along the ground. Had a 9mm pistol with us so we were safe, but our dog was the quietest I have ever seen him. I came to the conclusion they were coyotes, probably lured in by the scent of the elk meat we cooked on the fire beforehand. To the Georgia Anon, Ever seen the Etowah Mounds? They certainly gave me a unique feeling. My wife saw an apparition at Kennesaw Mountain near the Dead Angle. I was doing genealogical research and her fourth great-grandfather was situated there with a Georgia sharpshooter unit during the Battle of Kennesaw Mountain. Our dog will not walk up Church Street in Marietta. Many of the churches there were used as field hospitals during the Atlanta campaign. I admittedly kept seeing odd shadows moving around on Pigeon Hill around dusk.
Just gonna tell a quick one or two, though I got a hell of a lot more. Visiting family at the cabin. Remote portion at the bottom of a valley, surrounded by old hippie communes and secret wheat farms. Military base or something nearby, as military planes will regularly fly through the valley. Out drinking by bonfire in the middle of night, talking with my sister, everyone else is inside watching a movie. Sister points out something, moving fairly slowly for a plane, blotting out stars behind it. No wing lights or anything, but the silhouette is pretty fucking close to what a stealth bomber looks like, maybe a bit wider, IDK. For 30 seconds we watched it cruise towards us, and the second passed overhead, power goes out. Another one. Decide to hike for the day. Trying to embrace my inner Ted Kaczynski or Thoreau, only taking a sack with some water and a hammy Sammy sandwich. Been hiking for a good 5 or 6 hours, checking out some local glades, and deciding to shuffle back home. Pass by a decrepit farm, like something the Amish would make to intentionally haunt after death. Check it out, found some bats, which were sick. Find what I think was an old trail, can't tell with how thick with brush it was, might have just been a slightly less dense portion of forest. Take it as a detour, and in 10 minutes find a small open area. Only think there is a dog fucking impaled on a massive spike of wood, fucker just got Sephiroathed. Decide to turn around and find a different route. Nothing else happened besides that.
Appalachia is a very spooky place. The mountain range is the oldest in the world. Some land is obviously cursed. Others obviously soured. I live in a part of it where all the coal country is and there are underground mines completely surrounding my land. About a mile to the east there is an old mine entry from the late 1800s, a mile to the west there is one from the 1960s. I have the newest coal seam mine map produced by the Mine Safety and Health Administration every year, and my little plot of land of about 4 acres is the only land in my whole valley the coal companies haven't strip mined or deep mined. Like they avoided it for some reason. Which is odd, because the coal seam is thickest it appears right under my property. Whatever the reason, as kids I would explore these mountains with a buddy, and right on top of the mountain where my land is situated, is a false doorway, obviously made by someone, but it's crazy to think the huge rocks that are in place there were actually moved by someone to make the false doorway. I haven't been there since I was a kid, because the last time I went to that place, I had nightmares for a week. Visions in my sleep, of human sacrifice. The rocks sat perfectly up on top the ridge of the mountain, you could jump up on them and they were flat, huge square-shaped rocks. They were about 3 feet off the ground, the tops of the rocks, so you would walk up to them, and the floor of the rocks was waist-high. After you pulled yourself up onto the rocks, they made a walkway/floor that was about 10 feet wide and 10 feet long. If I remember correctly, there were 4 rocks in total that made this floor, and on the center of this rock floor was some other huge rocks, 2 rocks about 10 feet tall by 10 feet wide with a doorway in between the 2 rocks with a single rock stacked on top the other 2 stones in the center. The doorway had constant air blown through it, the wind was constant, no matter if the air was stirring or not. Very bad vibes from this place.
So this is a personal story that happened in Pikeville, Kentucky. Live in a holler in the middle of the woods. House is small and built somewhat into the side of a steep hill, a creek runs through my property. Be me on my porch around 7 p.m., after a fresh rain. Notice something odd in the kudzu, that forms a layer of plant life across some of the trees in my property, It's small and brown and about 50 feet away from me. Realize that I'm looking at something like a weird monkey's face, but flat and with no nose. It's very still. I'm concerned but not worried. It could have been a trick of the light. It stands/rears up, and its body is sort of like a salamander, but salamanders don't stand on their back legs. It's about 3 feet tall, its head was very flat, its front arms were stubby and its body was a mottled brown color. Its head was very spade-like, and I think that if it was on all fours, its face would be facing the ground given how its head was angled. I can't see its legs or if it had a tail or not. Its eyes stick out from its head and protrude farther out than anything else. It was moist-looking and its eyes were a bright yellow. It stood still with its little arms hanging limply at its side. I saw it open its mouth once. I believe I saw it licking its lips. The lines on its face that made it so monkey-like moved like they were wrinkles. It stared at me for a solid 30 seconds before scurrying into the trees like a lizard. I see a flash of something brown, what could have been a tail. I dunno what it was, but it reminded me of a salamander in terms of body shape.
In the time-trodden foothills of the Appalachians, there is a town that used to be. One won't find much in the way of history on the dead town of Sayre, Alabama, mainly because it's man's nature to forget the places he'd rather not remember, but at its meager zenith, it was a mining camp. In the truest sense of the term. From the hillside overlooking the Sayre mines, for our Yankee friends, that's Sayre, equal emphasis, rows of humble houses, little more than shacks when built, lined roads paved in the broken rock of their inhabitants' labor. Gray, the houses were. Battleship gray bleached toward white by decades of blistering sun. Even the occasional house of a differing shade, painted by someone fool enough to think they could bring some cheer to such a place, succumbed to the oppression of that gray community, its vibrancy crushed by forces not unlike those which formed the coal, heat, time, and the pressures of deep poverty. To the locals, it was simply the camp. My people were there before the camp, living in the hills for generations before civilization caught up with us. Half-breed Muskogee that we were, we had fought the relocation and kept title on our land. We lived across the Locust Fork, the river that divided that loose community like a line drunkenly scrawled in the earth in ink of muddy green. They were too proud to work in the earth, choosing to keep to the old ways. They trapped, hunted, and bartered with the camp folk. Some of them even served as a sort of off-the-books police force for the company. But hard times can force even the proud to humble themselves. When those hard times came, they crossed the fork and went to work for the company, my great-great-grandfather among the first. That was in the early days of American industry, before the conveyors and the steel behemoths that came to gnaw the roots of the mountains. Long before the laws preventing children from risking their short lives for company scrip. He and his two brothers wriggled down into holes far too crude to dignify as mine shafts, digging at the coal seam with short handle picks, crawling on their bellies hauling sacks filled with the dark, noxious rock. My ancestor, the youngest of the three, was still small enough that he could turn around in that cramped space, so he was elected to haul the sacks. One day as he was hauling out a load, he heard his brothers shouting, a brief commotion, then the terrifying growl of the shaft letting go. As the tale came down to me, he described it in these words. It sounded like the biggest, meanest dog you ever heard, only bigger and meaner, and it done eat you. His oldest brother shouted for him to get out as fast as he could and he did, hearing the tunnel collapse behind him as he went. He came out screaming for help, but the company man overseeing the dig took one look, said, "They're gone, boy," tasked one of the other miners with seeing him home, and went straight back to work. When he got home, the family left him there with his mother and struck out for the dig. They still held to the Muskogee Creek burial ways, so it wasn't about recovering their bodies, it was about respect. The fact that they just treated it like business as usual, weren't even willing to stop working long enough to respect the prayers being offered. Well, the rest of the family took that bad enough, but his mother went crazy with grief. She was something of an Owala, a medicine woman, and she cursed the company and the camp, saying that the water of the ground would become poison to them, the ground itself would burn beneath their feet, and the spirits of her dead sons would trouble those who refused to honor them. As the weeks passed, the hole where my great-uncles died began to flow with water. Many believed that they had struck a spring and had knocked loose the shaft supports retreating from the water. Others remembered my grandmother's words. In short order, that spring formed a tributary creek. In months, it had begun forming a pond, turning the surrounding terrain to marsh, effectively ending the mining operations on that particular hill. The locals said it was the curse. A few years later, one of the foreman's sons drowned in the fork, his body never recovered. One of the boys that was with him went to his grave swearing that something had pulled that boy under. Then the well water went bad. The company was forced to spend a small fortune on a deal with the Birmingham Water Works, running miles of pipe and new pumping stations to stop the hemorrhage in their workforce as they sought other employment, other homes, and water that didn't stink like death. They never really recovered. Decades later, they were still leasing those dilapidated shacks to anyone they could as the abandoned mining operation descended into ruin. By the time of my youth, the old sediment ponds had evaporated, and by some means no one ever quite explained, all those tons of sediment and coal dust began to smolder. My friends used to call them the cracks of doom, because at night you could see the red of the fires below shining up through the cracks in the mud. It still serves as my reminder that there are places in the world where hell lies a little closer to the surface. As for the spirits of my uncles, they're still around. As a child, my mother was spending a weekend with her grandparents. From her sleep on a hide bed in the living room, a sound from the kitchen awakened her. Fearing a mouse, she retrieved a flashlight from her grandparents' nightstand and went to investigate. Finding nothing, she was returning to bed when she stepped in something wet. There beneath the kitchen window was a small pool of water, no rain for days, just this inexplicable puddle. Then she noticed that leading away from it were what appeared to be the footprints of a child, footprints that stopped at the edge of her bed.
Dad's people are from bumblefuck Appalachia. I've got no stories myself, but my grandpa told me a bunch when I was little. The one that comes to mind right away is the story he told me about the moving trail. He used to tell me it before I went to bed, and it always spooked the bejesus out of me. Looking back, there isn't much to it, but oh well. Basically, the moving trail was the quickest route to the next town. Just an old dirt road. But most everyone avoided it because they said it would shift on you and take you farther than you intended to go. You'd wind up walking for hours before you recognized anything. Anyway, Grandpa was a young sprat at the time, I think about 11. First thing to know is that his dad was a lousy drinker. Going home usually meant a rough beating, so Grandpa would spend hours alone up in the mountain, avoiding the house. But one day he came home and his dad was spitting nails, just drunk off his ass. Grandpa caught the worst of it. When it was over, he decided he'd had enough and struck out on his own. He was all riled up, and didn't even realize that he was walking along the moving trail. When he realized it, he got nervous. But nothing looked off, so he just kept going. Soon he reached a fork in the road. One path went up the mountain, the other went down. Grandpa head up, but soon the path just hit a dead end at this sort of cliff face. So Grandpa turns around and heads back to the fork in the road. But he never reaches it. He just keeps walking and walking. The path travels through some woods, and when Grandpa emerges from them, he's surprised to find himself face to face with his own house. He hears his dad inside cursing and yelling up a storm, so he instantly darts back into the woods. but the trail he was just taking is gone. Nothing but grass and roots and sticks all over the ground.
I have lived many decades in deep southern rural Appalachia and have indeed heard all manner of haint, spook, and just strange tales for my entire duration. I have indeed witnessed things here that I shall never tell, some of which was so blatant and grand as to be unequivocally undeniable. As a child, by far most I ever met and knew held such awarenesses, but it has died more and more with each fresh generation. The area becomes more modernly developed and homogenized into the greater mega-corporate version of reality, which intentionally supplants actual reality, and people being, on the whole, dumber than chickens, tend to just go right on unquestionably along with that which they are being fed. The irony there is that a lot of folks around these parts like to imagine themselves as seeing through the bullshit, in such regards, and the corporations feed them things that enable them to think and feel as if they are rebelling against the modern corporate encroachments, but they are simply taking a second hook, line and sinker that's just decorated up a little differently than the other. They are both controlled by Satan. For you see, that's essentially the entire plan behind the whole thing, Satan convincing the world that there is no supernatural, and that only material things, entertainment, fun, self-gratification, etc. matters. We are merely fortunate cosmic accidents, more or less, than happen to be able to think and be aware of highly complex things, thanks to nothing more than chemical reactions. I am certainly grateful for having come at the tail end of the real magic, being so much more readily interactable. Around here the 80s was pretty much the final burst, also keeping in mind that we were still decades behind any sort of metro areas. It's all still there for anyone able to shift their personal paradigm back around to it, I'm sure, but modern programming is a powerful wall. I recommend time alone in the wilderness with the Holy Bible.
Come on Anon, just give us one.
No sir, I will not tell any of the serious ones. I will, however, mention the local, special-minded kid that could draw you a map from anywhere to anywhere else with chalk in his driveway, all from his own mind, and it match up exactly with actuality. Oh, here's you a tiny one. I had an uncle that if you got a wart you could go to him and he would have a conversation with the wart that you couldn't understand, but it would make the wart disappear within a few days, every time. You could have had that wart for months before you gave in and went to give that shit a shot, and sure enough, very soon you'd wake up and it'd be just totally gone without a trace. He was supposed to hand that down to someone, and I hoped he'd pick me, but no one knows of him having done so to anyone, and he had no children. He also had a blue jay bird that lived in his house and just flew around free in there.
Pretty cool. Always nice hearing about hillbilly occultism. Seems much less try-hard than a lot of things city slicker, witches, practice.
Well, we had our share of that here in my county, which all came to a head during the 90s, which contains the bulk of what I will not mention a word of. For the general population, as I said, the more common aspects pretty much ended in the 80s, but the shit that happened in the 90s within a select group of people was likely among the most incredible series of events to occur upon this earth since perhaps the Book of Revelation was written. It wasn't centered around try-hards and witches, but there were quite a few of those in the peripheral of it, or at least one might assume it inspired a good number of them into being such. Still to this day, I cannot figure out what to make of it all. I have seriously considered just going to some kind of therapist or whatever and laying all that on them wide open, but there is just no way anyone that didn't experience it firsthand would ever truly believe even bits and pieces of it, really. I was there for 98% of it and still have a difficult time accepting the reality. I think it all lasted about 3 years.
I hope that you enjoyed tonight's broadcast. If you enjoyed tonight's story, then please subscribe to the channel as more Greentexts will appear daily. A new broadcast will appear when the clock strikes midnight Central Time.